You've seen him as a Fox contributor, and you know that he writes for National Review and involved with AEI as well. So without further ado, I'm delighted and welcome Jonah Goldberg.
So, I don't have that problem. A couple of things. First of all, I appreciate short introductions, but one of the problems with them is that you often get the things you're most proud of in your career left out. And for those of you who know or don't know, I've been a columnist for the LA Times for about a decade or more. That's not what I'm proud of. But when the LA Times picked me up as a columnist, Barbra Streisand publicly canceled her subscription in protest. And sort of in my line of work, it really doesn't get much better than that. I should say, I hear that you're going to have Andrew Clavin out here. Andrew's an old friend of mine. We're buddies. And the biggest favor that you can do for a speaker who's funny is to lower expectations. So I just want to tell you, he's awful. And you can tell him I said so. No, on the funny thing, it's a little awkward, right? Because I get billed a lot as like this funny and insightful, humorous and thoughtful and this kind of thing. And it's a weird mix, right? And it's a hard needle to thread. It kind of makes me feel like the guy who wants to be both a veterinarian and a taxidermist. Because that way you can promise you'll get your dog back no matter what. So I want to say how delighted I am to be out here for the conservatives of Silicon Valley, which is, a little oxymoronic. It's, the world's the tallest skyscraper in Kansas. It's a little weird. I mean, I grew up, just so you know, I kind of know where you're coming from. I grew up in a very conservative political family on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And we were a bit like Christians in ancient Rome. You'd meet in Central Park and you draw a little C in the dirt and you're like, I'll meet you in the catacombs under Zabars, And I've never lived anywhere my vote wasn't canceled out at least 9-1. I guess I should start with, because I have such a cheery topic tonight, or at least title, I should start with a old story that I like. It's about a medical school professor who teaches anatomy, right? And it's in one of these big auditoriums with students filled all the way up to the top of the back row. And he just wants to see if the students have done the assigned reading. And so he walks right in and he just asks outright, he says, what organ of the human body, when properly stimulated, increases 8 times in size? And then he looks at his little seating chart and he picks a very prim and proper young lady and says, Ms. Jones. And Ms. Jones starts to blush and she starts to squirm and she says, Professor, I couldn't answer a question like that. I'm sorry, I just couldn't say. And the professor goes, okay, Mr. Smith. And the wise ass in the front of the room says, the pupil of the human eye when it goes from light to dark. And the professor says, that is correct. Now, Ms. Jones, I have 3 things to say to you. 1, you didn't do your homework. 2, you have a filthy mind. And 3, you are destined to live a life of unfulfilled expectations. It's always good to start with sort of a Harvey Weinstein flavor joke. So just so you know, I've been sort of home working like Howard Hughes with Kleenex boxes on my feet on this book that I've been working on for several years now, and I haven't figured out quite how to talk about it. So I'm going to do it in a sort of impressionistic way. I hope you'll bear with me for a minute. One of the things I've been trying to figure out is a sort of a literary device. And for a long time, I toyed with this gimmick from the movie They Live, I don't know if very many people in this room have ever seen it. It's not what you would call a good movie. It was directed by John Carpenter, the horror guy, right? And it stars one of my favorite wrestlers who died a few years ago, Rowdy Roddy Piper. And Rowdy Piper has his best line in the movie is, "I've come here today to chew gum and kick ass, and I'm all out of gum." And but anyway, so it's this weird sci-fi movie where Roddy Piper plays a hard-working, everyman, bourgeois, middle-class, salt of the earth, normal American who works hard and just wants to chase the American dream. And then one day he picks up a pair of sunglasses on the street, and all of a sudden he discovers that all advertising, all billboards, all magazines have these subliminal messages in them that tell you to behave, obey, reproduce, don't speak out, right? And when he takes them off, everything's normal. And then when he puts them back on, he sees that there's this hidden world from him. And then he discovers that every now and then he sees people who are these hideous, alien, deformed monsters with sort of upturned noses. Think of, like, if you remember Henry Waxman, something like that. And so it turns out that this evil race of alien beings has taken over planet Earth, and it's ordering us all to sort of follow orders, stay in line, not act out, not protest, not do anything. And so one of the interesting things about this movie, it is actually easily the most popular movie for Frankfurt School Marxists of the last 30 years. And if you look at it, if you look into it, if you Google it, you will find all sorts of egghead, hardcore, doctrinaire Marxist magazines that have written about this movie because they think it's the best piece of sort of propaganda for Marxism in a long time. That's not why I bring it up. I'm sort of interested in this idea of seeing the world just a little differently. And so I'm not going to ask you to put on an imaginary pair of sunglasses, but instead just sort of imagine that you're an alien, right? And your job is to check out what's going on with this species called Homo sapiens on this fairly obscure planet in this corner of the galaxy. And you're sent here, let's just pick a round number, once every 10,000 years, okay? So let's assume that you started coming here 250,000 years ago, right? And there's a debate about when Homo sapiens split off in the evolutionary ladder, and you'll see why, but let's just assume that evolutionary theory is just basically correct, and we don't have to have that argument now. For the last 250,000 years, so some people think we split off from Neanderthals and whatnot 300,000 years ago, some people say 200,000, so just call it 250,000. First thing you'd see, what you might write in your notebook is something like semi-hairless apes foraging and fighting for food. Come back in 10,000 years. You would write semi-hairless apes foraging and fighting for food, no change. Come back in 10,000 years. Semi-hairless apes foraging and fighting for food. You'd come here basically just shy of 24 times, and you would write the same thing. You might talk about how the population has moved around, but the population has stayed fairly stable, according to the evolutionary record, for 240,000 years. On your 25th visit, you might get here just in time to see, I don't know, like Miley Cyrus twerking at the Super Bowl. The point I'm making is that according to everything that science and anthropology and sociology and archaeology tells us, all of the stuff that we associate with human progress, from shoes and pants to indoor plumbing and cars, all of this happened in the last 10,000 years. But the most amazing thing is almost all of it really happened in the last 250 to 300 years. For 7,500 generations, Homo sapiens, humans, lived on average at $3 a day or less, everywhere around the world. Ancient China, ancient Rome, ancient Aztecs, South America, North America, doesn't matter. It is like, you know all that stuff about the hockey stick with greenhouse gases, right? Much more interesting hockey stick is the one that looks like this, where we're all living on about $3 per day until about 1700 when it starts to go like this. As one of my favorite economists put it, Todd Buchholz, he says, "For most of man's life on earth, he has lived no better on 2 legs than he had on 4. Economic historian David Landis put it this way. He says, "The Englishman of 1750 was closer in material things to Caesar's legionnaires than to his own great-grandchildren." So that's the setup for the first of my 2 arguments that I make in this book. I make a lot of arguments in this book. It's a long book. But the 2 central themes of it are sort of essential to it. And the first one is simply this. Capitalism is unnatural. Democracy is unnatural. Prosperity is unnatural. In a very real sense, if Garden of Eden existed, it was a slum. Liberty, whether economic or political, is unnatural. The reason why the founding fathers say that it's self-evident that we are endowed by our Creator with individual rights, with natural rights, inalienable rights, is because it's actually a hard case to argue going by the historical record. And so they just simply asserted it. And thank God that they did. Though I should say, in my book, there is no God. It's the first sentence of the book. There is no God in this book. And it's not because I don't believe in God. I do believe in God. But I'm not trying to persuade people who are open to the argument that God gave us all of this great stuff. I'm trying to persuade people who actually believe all of human history is just the interplay of cold, impersonal material forces, and that we are nothing but dog meat or whatever it is we are, and that we are in charge of creating a heaven on earth and all the rest. I'm trying to persuade people who disagree with me. And this is a really important part, and also bring along some people who do agree with me, but this is a really important point I want to make about conservatism right now, is that a lot of people on the right have given up on the idea of persuading people that they disagree with. And instead, all we have to do is rally our side to beat their side, and we've sort of lost sight of the importance of argument, of bringing people together. Go back to Aristotle. The whole point of politics is to convince people that their interests are better represented in your coalition than somebody else's. And when you give up on persuasion, you're turning your back on what democracy is supposed to be about. Anyway, there goes my sermon. I'm sorry I'm drinking so much water. I smoked an enormous amount of pot before I got here, and I get this crazy dry mouth. So even though I believe in God, and I think God plays an important role and all of that, I think what you have to admit is as the idea of God is hugely important to the advance of Western civilization, of civilization generally. I'm not going to get deep in the weeds on this stuff, but basically the Reader's Digest version goes like this. The Jews are the ones who sort of, my people, are the ones who come up with monotheism, right? They're the ones who invent the idea of the moral dignity of the individual, including of women, which is one of the reasons why a lot of pagans think everything went wrong when the Jews came along, because they elevated the role of women. But the Jewish argument was basically about one tribe, the Jews. And Christianity comes along and universalizes it and says, no, we're all children of God, not just the chosen people. And so they take this tribal concept and they expand it to everybody. All humans are worthy of respect by virtue of the fact that they're children of God. And then there's another contribution that Christianity makes, mostly through St. Augustine, but also through Jesus, this whole idea that there is a realm of society that is essentially secular. That is, what St. Augustine called the city of man and the city of God. And that, or as Jesus says, you must render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's. And it was this idea that we can't all look into your soul, but we all have to get along. And so we're going to create a space in society for people to live according to man's laws so that we can all get along. And that idea grew into a big chunk of where we get individualism from, where we get pluralism from, where we get democracy from. But Jews gave us better jokes. For example, I don't know, why don't Jewish mothers drink? Because alcohol interferes with the suffering. One of my favorites is, this is an old Borscht Belt joke for those of you who don't know, but a Jewish guy's crossing the street, he gets hit by a car, a Good Samaritan runs over, takes off his coat, uses a pillow, and he says, "Are you comfortable?" And the old man says, I make a living. Anyway, back to the argument. So, it is amazingly difficult to comprehend how quickly prosperity happened. I call it the miracle, and we'll get to that. This idea of just this idea of prosperity, of human flourishing, is so recent in our memory. I'll give you an example. President John Tyler, 10th President of the United States, born in 1790, his grandkids are alive today. Another way to think about it is my dad was born when Oliver Wendell Holmes was on the Supreme Court. Holmes fought in the Civil War under Lincoln. Lincoln was a young man working on a farm in Indiana when John Quincy Adams was president. John Quincy Adams, as a boy, heard the gunfire at the siege of Boston. Right? 5 lifetimes since the hockey stick blade started to go up. 5 lifetimes is a rounding error in human history. So anyway, my point is, if capitalism, democracy, liberalism in the classical sense were natural, they might have showed up a little earlier, right? Instead, we stumbled into it one time, and one time only, and in one place, in England. Now, there are people, bitter Dutch jingoists, who think it happened in Holland, and we can have that argument if you like, but let's just say in this one little tiny corner of Europe it happened, and it started to spread, and people got richer, people got freer, and this raises sort of the most profound and important question in public policy broadly understood. You hear people all the time ask, why is there poverty? We know why there's poverty, right? I mean, in a sense, you have to be too stupid to be a spell checker at an M&M factory to ask, why is there poverty, right? We know why there's poverty. Poverty is the factory preset of the human condition. As a species and as individuals, we are all born naked, ignorant, and penniless, right? The only interesting question is, why is there wealth? And there's only one answer, and it's this thing that happened. And it's this thing that I call the Lockean Revolution. I call it the Lockean Revolution after John Locke, but we'll get to it in a second. He didn't create it. He just simply wrote down a lot of its principles that helped spread it around. And so what are the ideas of the Lockean Revolution? Well, there are a few of them, but basically it goes like this, that we are citizens, not subjects, that the fruits of our labor belong to us, that our rights come from God, not from government, that we are captains of ourselves, that the individual is sovereign, right? And these are the ideas that are basically baked into the American founding. Barack Obama got a lot of grief from a lot of us when he said that, you know, basically the only thing that keeps the Constitution alive is our belief in it. But he's right in the sense that if everybody in America tomorrow said, who gives a damn about the Constitution, it would no longer bind this country to anything. Problem is sort of the reverse. It's too many people already don't believe in the Constitution, and that's what's getting us into a lot of trouble. But my point is that these ideas, right, these ideas of individual sovereignty, of the idea of that innovation is a good thing. For most of human history, innovation was considered to be not just bad, but a sin. The sin of curitas, of questioning the status quo. It is amazing how many people who, if they tried to build a better mousetrap, were killed for it. You know, I think something like 17,000 people were killed who were trying to violate the guild's protection racket on wool in France in like one generation. One of the reasons why science has failed in places like China and the Middle East and lots of parts of the world where they were more advanced than Europe for a long time is because innovation was seen as a threat to the powers that be. And then something happens in the West, starting in England, or Holland, where all of a sudden innovation is seen as a good thing, right? Where the middle class, the commercial class, starts to assert that, hey, you know, we're the ones who are working really hard. We're the ones who are paying taxes, not you dissolute aristocrats who just feed off of us, right? We're the ones who are actually making the society prosperous. We demand some recognition and respect. And that's basically where democracy comes from. And that's true across the world even today. In development economics, you need a strong middle class to demand its rights in order to lock in democracy. And one of the amazing things about the American founding wasn't these brilliant ideas in the Constitution, and they are brilliant. You know, what has two thumbs and loves the Constitution? This guy, right? But the really amazing thing about the American founding is that they wrote this stuff down, and they made it really, really hard to change. And so we froze in place this really unbelievably radical thing, this idea, this miracle, right? And we said, this is what we're going to live by forever. And it was a reflection of our culture, and then it secured our culture because it was written down and sort of sanctified. So that's the first part of the argument. The second part of the argument has to do with corruption. Now, in everyday talk, when we talk about corruption, you talk about people taking bribes, right, or graft. That's part of corruption, but that's not what I mean. If you actually go back and you read the way the Bible talks about corruption, or if you go back and read the history in the Oxford English Dictionary about what corruption meant, right, it means rot. It means decay. It means entropy, right? Ashes to ashes and dust to dust. In Game of Thrones, whenever a wound is infected, they say, oh, the flesh is corrupted, right? And what it means is that it's going back to nature. And that's how I look at human nature, right? The Roman poet Horace had this great line. He says, you can chase nature out with a pitchfork, but it will always come rushing back in, right? If you don't maintain a boat, a house, a car, eventually rust comes in and takes it. Termites will come in. Termites are just as happy to eat a beautiful grandfather clock as they are an outhouse, right? Rust never sleeps. That's what nature does. And if you think of human nature as just another part of nature, it takes active effort to keep human nature from not reasserting itself, right? To consider nepotism, right? Nepotism is the idea of giving favoritism to family. Well, there has never been a society anywhere in human history where people don't give preference to their own family. It is just hardwired into us, you know. There's that great line from Senator Phil, when he was Senator Phil Graham. He was asked in a little group, you know, what is his education policy? And he said, well, I start from the premise, my education policy starts from the premise that I love my kids more than the government does. And this woman says, oh, no, that's not true. I love your kids every bit as much as you do. And Phil Graham, who I love, shoots right back, oh yeah, what are their names? Every human society in history, including to this day, you give favoritism over friends. This is over strangers. It's a hardwired thing that is in us, right? The trick, though, is how it's not to say we're going to get rid of human nature. It's how you deal with human nature. And every human being, there's this amazing thing called Dunbar's number. And they found that sociologist named something Dunbar, Robert Dunbar, I think, who found that every human being, we are wired to only really know about 150 to 200 people. That is sort of the outward limit of what our brains can have personal relationships with. And this holds constant all around the world. And that's because we evolved to live in small bands and tribes, in these little groups, and that was our whole universe. And the amazing thing, one of the amazing things that the miracle did was it allows us to find a way to deal with strangers. Distrust of strangers is hardwired into us. There's this wonderful book called Just Babies that just does psychological experiments on babies from like 3 years and younger. And they find that babies cry in accents when they're born, that babies have fear of people who speak foreign languages long before they can speak a word because they hear this stuff in utero. We are hardwired with a lot of software, right? And one of the software is we want to be part of a group. The philosopher Friedrich Hayek calls this the microcosm, right? This intimate world that we live in, your community of faith, friends, family, work, whatever you want to call it. And then there's this thing called the macrocosm, which is the extended order of liberty, contractual society, the Lockean revolution. And what that thing does is it says that if you meet somebody and they have an apple, the right thing to do is and you want it, the right thing to do is buy it from them rather than hit them over the head with a rock, which is the standard procedure for 250,000 years. And this is something you have to teach people, that you have to learn. And if you don't teach people these things, if you don't teach people to treat strangers with respect, the way Christianity does, the way democracy does, the way classical liberalism does, then you fall back on human nature and you start distrusting strangers. You start saying, my tribe gets everything, your tribe sucks, I'm going to kill you, right? Everything becomes zero-sum again. And the amazing irony of all this, I mean, I like the anecdote about the car at the beginning. The amazing anecdote about this is that liberal democratic capitalism is the single greatest thing ever invented for maximizing human happiness and letting people cooperate peacefully. It's just got one drawback. It doesn't feel like it. It is so cooperative, the cooperation becomes invisible. There's sort of one of the founding essays of libertarianism is this essay called I, Pencil, by a guy named Leonard Read. And it's written from the point of view of the pencil. And the pencil's like, I am an Eberhard and Faber #2 pencil, blah, 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 blah. He goes on and he says, my wood comes from Canada. My paint comes from Delaware. My rubber comes from Indonesia. My tin comes from Argentina. And my graphite comes from graphite land. I don't know where graphite comes from. But it says, think about it. You have these people all around the planet who speak different languages, worship different gods, have different histories, and yet they work together seamlessly to produce a pencil from all around the world that costs like less than 2 cents a piece. And it's because capitalism does that. There was a great exhibit a few years ago at the British Museum in London where called iToaster, where a guy made a toaster from scratch. And when I say scratch, I mean scratch, like he mined the tin, I don't know how you galvanized the rubber, but he made it from scratch, right? Took him 6 years. It was a crappy toaster. There's more recently a guy made a chicken sandwich from scratch. He raised the egg, turned it into a chicken, he grew the lettuce, he grew the flour, he milled the wheat into flour, blah, 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 blah. Whole thing cost him $1,500. Took 6 months, and it was, he says, you can look it up on YouTube, it was an okay sandwich. You know. Capitalism lets us cooperate in ways that are unimaginably efficient and productive and make people richer, but it doesn't feel like it. And so here's the problem, is that the only way, let me put it this way, you cannot get meaning from capitalism. Capitalism cannot fill a hole in your soul, right? Work can do that. Productive work, profitable work can do that. The camaraderie that comes with work can do that. But the system itself, that's not what it's for. You know, as my friend John Bolton likes to say, you know, some tools depend upon what you want to use them for. Is a knife better than a spoon? Well, it depends. Are you eating soup, right? Capitalism is great for a lot of things, but it's not very good at the things it's not very good at. And one of the things it's not good at is giving you meaning. Neither is democracy. Because the whole idea of this country, the whole idea of the miracle, was that the government, or before that, the king or the church, wasn't going to give you meaning. You were going to pursue it on your own. The pursuit of happiness is an individual right. And what one person's happiness is another person's misery. And the whole idea of freedom was letting people discover it on their own. And the only place you can do that is not as an individual, and it's not through government, it's on this stuff in the middle, called civil society, called the institutions of life. There are only 5, social science is pretty settled on this, there are only about 5 or 6 things that give you happiness in life. I mean real happiness, satisfaction, contentment. It's faith, friends, relationships, family, experiences. Genes are important because some people are just born miserable bastards. And this thing called earned success. Now, earned success doesn't mean being rich. Earned success means being needed. Earned success means that you feel like you made a special contribution to your community, to the world. It means that you feel like if you died tomorrow, you would be missed or remembered well. It's this idea that you matter. And some people get it out of a sense of earned success out of getting really rich. Some people get a sense of earned success by being successful great moms. Some people priests. Some people writers. Everyone's got a different definition of what they're thinking for personal success. I know people who are miserable at their jobs, but incredibly happy because they coach Little League and they're valued in their community, right? And this is the problem. Government can't give you that. Government can increase your net worth, but it can't increase your self-worth. Government can't love you. It can just write you a check. And when people think that the government can take over the things that civil society does, family, church, community, sports, schools, they miss the fact that if I borrow money from my Uncle Ted, right, he gets to hawk me about it. He gets to say, what are you doing? Why are you spending money on that when you owe me money for this? The government can't do that. The government just gives you stuff. In real life, in civil society, things come with strings attached, with meaning that convey care and concern, right? And so you have, in civil society, that's where you find meaning. we're all proud to be Americans. Well, I think in this room, we're all proud to be Americans. There are a lot of people who aren't. But in a real sense, you don't live in America. Right? America is kind of an abstraction. You live in your communities. You live among your neighbors. You live among your friends. And the problem that we have in society right now is that civil society is dying away. People are retreating for lots of reasons, and we can get into them if you want, but I probably should just skip it and just assert it, because I think you probably believe me, that people are retreating to Facebook, as if Facebook is a substitute, that a virtual community is a substitute for a real community, right? They're retreating to cable news, and they watch, the tribalism and the carnival shows at night, thinking that it's the same thing of actually being involved in politics. They watch it like it's a sport, rooting for one team or the other team. And it develops this sense, because we're tribal by nature, and these people are just outside of our Dunbar's number, and they're strangers, and they say things that we don't like, so we treat them like they're characters in a movie or a play rather than real human beings. And, one of my wife got it for me for my birthday a few years ago, got it blown up. It's a New Yorker cartoon, and it says, it has two dogs sitting at a bar drinking martinis, and one dog says to the other dog, it's not good enough that dogs succeed. Cats must also fail, right? And we sort of live in that world right now, where we take the real joy isn't having some sort of policy victory or anything like that. It's, you just read Twitter for 5 seconds, and it's like opening up the Ark of the Covenant at the end of Indiana Jones. But it's all, butthurt, and your tears are delicious, and, I dunked on you, and I drank your milkshake, and all this kind of nonsense. And the point seems to be that it's just making people feel bad on the other side is the point of politics. And don't get me wrong, I grew up in this stuff. I met Pat Buchanan at my bris. I've been involved in this stuff for a long time. And I think that it might explain some of his attitudes towards my people. But the point is that that's not what this whole project is supposed to be about. But the problem is, if the proper sources of meaning and belonging in life disappear, you don't lose your desire for it, you just look elsewhere. And typically, for the last 30, 40 years, since FDR basically, the Democrats have been much better than the Republicans at telling a story about how you can get meaning from government, right? I attended the Democratic Convention in 2012, mostly out of reasons having to do with original sin, and the opening video at the Democratic Convention began with the words, "The government is the one thing we all belong to." Now, as a sort of a Tea Party kind of guy, that makes me want to flip the safety on my rifle, right? I mean, the whole point of this thing that we live in is that Our rights come from God, not from government. We are citizens, not subjects. We form government to do limited and certain things, but reserve all other rights for ourselves because the individual and the people are upstream of government. And I don't want to belong to it. It belongs to me, right? But I know this is shocking, but a guy who's worked at National Review for coming up on 20 years is not the target audience for the opening video at the Democratic Convention. And there are people, good people, decent people, people who are really struggling in life because they don't have faith, family, friends, community, who hear government is the one thing I can belong to, that I can be part of. And that is incredibly seductive to people. And I have sympathy for them, and a little bit of pity, but sympathy for them, because if you come from a bad family or a bad community and you want to belong to something, finding the idea that the one branch of the government in Washington is this thing that will give you meaning, that will fill the hole in your soul, that's somebody in crisis. That's someone who's got problems. And the problem with the pitch is that it's fool's gold. The government cannot love you. The government cannot be your mommy, your daddy, it can't be your family, it can't be your tribe. All it can do is be government, which is good and proper for a handful of things and pretty bad at the rest. And so here's the really important point. In a lot of ways I see this as a prequel to this book I wrote called Liberal Fascism, that any attempt to take the microcosm, the world where we have tribal thinking, right? Think about your own family. Almost every person in here who has kids, or I think every person in here had parents, in my family, I'm a communist, right? I mean, the old Marxist doctrine of communism is from each according to his ability to each according to their needs, right? I don't care if my daughter's bad at math. I'm still going to feed her, and I'm not going to charge her for it, right? I don't put price tags on the food in the refrigerator. I don't charge her rent, right? Inside the family, capitalism has no place, right? There's some sitcom that has this great line where a guy says, in this family, this family is a dictatorship, and I'm the dick. And it doesn't work in my family because it's a matriarchy. But anyway, the point is that in the family, we don't do contracts. We don't do capitalism and markets, right? We're a tribe in the family. And I think everybody understands that if you tried to take the logic of the macrocosm, of contracts and natural rights and free markets, and try to apply it to the family, you would destroy the family, right? If you just treated your kid like an employee, if you just treated your wife like an employee, I don't get me started. So we all understand that. What we don't understand is that if you take the logic of the microcosm and try to apply it to the larger society, you destroy that too. Because the second you say the entire country should be run like a family, you're saying no more voting for anything, right? You're saying no more charging for anything, no more contracts. We're just all in it together, right? And this is something that suffuses liberalism, is this idea, this cult of unity. If we could just, when Barack Obama ran, it was, we need to be unified for change and change for unification and unified hopefulness for more unity and whatnot. And the problem is, and this is one of the major themes of liberal fascism, is that, unity in and of itself is neither good nor bad. It's completely amoral. It's like fire, right? It's a tool. You can do it for good things, like cooking food and feeding people and giving them warmth, or you can burn villages down. It depends what you do with it. Unity is a force, right? It's fascism. The term fascism comes from the old symbol of Roman authority, which was a bundle of sticks around an axe. And it literally meant strength in numbers. And so when I hear people say we all have to be like one American family, right? Or we need to, Barack Obama gave a State of the Union address where he said, wouldn't it be great if we could all be like, if America could just be like SEAL Team 6? Because I don't know if you remember, but he killed Osama bin Laden. He mentioned it once or twice. Wouldn't it be great if we just be like SEAL Team 6, where we put aside our personal differences, we put aside our individual selfish pursuits, and we just all work together towards one common goal? And my answer to that is hell no. Because the whole reason we have a military is not to provide a model of best practices for how to organize civil society. We have a military so as to protect civil society so we can all be free. But there is this incredibly seductive thing about getting rid of democracy and living in this sort of tribal unity, right? I always like to tell college students to talk about how we need to be unified and we need unity and all that. It's like, you know who's unified? Rape gangs, the mafia, they're unified. So are firefighters and the Marines, and that's great. But again, it depends what you're using the unity for. My old boss, William F. Buckley, he always used to take umbrage when people would compare the Soviet Union and the United States as morally equivalent. We both have nuclear weapons, we both have big armies. And Bill would always say, well, look, if you have one man who pushes old ladies in front of oncoming buses and another man who pushes old ladies out of the way of oncoming buses, it simply will not do to describe them both as the sorts of men who push old ladies around. Right? It depends what you use it for. So I'm skipping over a lot of stuff, but I want to get sort of close to the end because I think I'm running out of time on here, right? Part of my argument is that the miracle is being corrupted. We are reverting back to human nature because I shouldn't say no one, not enough people are doing the hard work of keeping this thing going. I think Deirdre McCloskey, who's this economist, economic historian, I really am indebted to, said it very well, where she says that she's the one who made this argument that the miracle comes from how we change the way we talk. Right? Every civilization is essentially the story we tell ourselves about ourselves. Change the story, you change the civilization. Right? We're just, 24 hours away past Columbus Day? Listen to how people talk about Columbus Day. Only thing you're supposed to know about the guy is that he murdered indigenous people and he brought, greedy, selfish capitalism and blah, 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 blah. I have no problem teaching the bad stuff about Christopher Columbus. What I have a problem with is only teaching the bad stuff about Christopher Columbus. So much of what passes for college education today, and forget college, high school and grade school education, and not just in the public schools, at fancy pants elite private schools like the ones my kid goes to, is that it's not that they're being taught lies, they're being taught half-truths, which are the most effective kind of lie. And I absolutely think we should teach about slavery. It's a great stain on the American tradition, and I can give you my argument about slavery and all that if you want. But the point is, I don't want to be boulderizing and censoring out history. But if you don't tell the whole story, all you do is leave one narrative, and you teach people, whole generations of people, that there is nothing good in our story. And so why should we be surprised if they're not loyal to our story, if they're not grateful for our story? Right? Howard Zinn, the most widely written, most widely used American history textbook in high schools and colleges, he openly says, I write history from the perspective of the Iroquois and the Arapaho and the slave and the Trail of Tears and all this kinds of stuff. He writes the story purely from the perspective of the victims. And it's a weird analogy, but I kind of think of it, remember the movie Goldfinger, the James Bond movie? Right? Goldfinger's plan wasn't to rob Fort Knox. His plan was simply to irradiate the gold in Fort Knox so no one could use it. And that meant that his gold would be vastly more valuable. And that's what a lot of these intellectuals do, is they irradiate the useful parts of our past. They take the heroic stories of our past and they turn them into stories of villainy. And they make the good parts of our story unusable. And that's a huge problem. And that's why, how to put this? At the end of the day, conservatism is simply gratitude. Gratitude, you don't want to conserve things you're not grateful for. right? You have to be grateful for the wonderful things that this country did. You have to be grateful for the miracle. And this is why I say there's no God in the book, because people who don't believe in God don't want to hear they should be grateful for God. But maybe they want to be grateful for indoor plumbing and dentistry and not dying before the age of 30, which was normal until very, very recently. Maybe they want to be grateful for democracy and free speech. Well, less than you might think these days. But that's what I'm trying to talk about is gratitude. And I'll close with this. Most of us have heard the story of the goose that lays the golden egg, right? It comes from Aesop, and maybe even before Aesop. When it enters the West in the 14th and 15th centuries, it comes in through France and England, and the two most common versions. In one, it's a single guy who finds this goose, just waddles into his life, and starts, churning out one golden egg a day, which I tried to do the math on what, like 1536, wages a golden egg would be. It's a lot, right? And he asks the goose, give me two. And the goose very politely says, I'm sorry, sir, I cannot. And the guy gets enraged and he kills it. Right? In the French version, it's a couple who finds the goose that lays the golden egg. And they use their reason and their logic, not their rage. They use their reason and their logic, and they say, well, if it's squeezing out one golden egg a day, there must be a giant lump of gold inside. Let's cut it open and check it out. And of course, they kill it, right? So, and the way the story is normally told is that the moral of the story is greed. Yeah, and greed plays a part, fine. But the real moral of the story in both is ingratitude. Right? If someone came into your house every day and dropped off a suitcase full of $1 million free and clear, would you yell at them one day and say, you owe me too, right? No, you'd shovel the sidewalk, and you'd make sure he had a safe path, and you buy security guards to escort him from the boat. It doesn't matter. You do a lot. If you had a goose that laid a golden egg, you would build a great fence around it. You would protect it from wildlife, and you would make sure it's comfortable 10 times a day. Can I get you another latte? What can I do for you, right? Everything around us is the golden egg. The world that we live in is so and it's still going on. Every single day, something like 235,000 people drink clean water for the first time, thanks to the market. Every single day, another 300,000 people have electricity in their home, thanks to the spread of capitalism. It is the largest single decrease in human poverty in all of world history has happened in the last 3 decades around the world. Has it created problems for us? Absolutely. Will historians wonder why we weren't grateful for this incredible transformation of humanity? I certainly hope so. And so the moral of my story is we got to start teaching people gratitude. We got to start teaching people that this is really much better than what human beings have any sense of entitlement to. And if we don't, then the people who want to say that they should be running everything, or that we should be living like a family or a tribe or whatever. Socialism was tribalism for one class, fascism was tribalism for one state, Nazism was tribalism for one race. It's all the same arguments, just with different uniforms, right? The only amazing, truly transformative new idea in the last, I'll just say 2,000 years, and last name is Goldberg, I sometimes get in trouble for this, but is this Lockean idea, right? This amazing thing. And we should be incredibly grateful for it. Because human nature is always waiting just around the corner, whispering at us, it doesn't need to be like this. This is unnatural. We need to go back to the way we expected it. Hannah Arendt, one of my favorite intellectuals, used to say, every generation, Western civilization is invaded by barbarians. We call them children. And that's absolutely true, right? And I'll give you, so if you ever saw The Godfather, of course you saw The Godfather, but if you didn't see The Godfather, get out. No, so remember the opening scene in The Godfather, where Bonacera is talking to the Godfather because on the day of his daughter's wedding, he cannot refuse anybody a favor. And there's this long story where Bonacera's daughter was roughed up probably raped by 2 boys. And then because one of the boys was the son of a politician who did favors, who called in a favor with the judge, they got a suspended sentence, right? And so Bonacera goes to the Godfather and explains all of this and says, I want you to kill them. And the Godfather gets furious and says, why would you ask me to do this? And he says, what do I have to pay you? And the Godfather gets even angrier. He says, look, you never wanted to be my friend. You wanted to be a good American and play by the rules, right? You never wanted to offer me your loyalty. You wanted to be a good American who doesn't play by these kinds of things. And I understood, I respected that, even though my wife is the godmother to your child. But now you come here and you ask me to do this for money. Why would you show me this disrespect? And it goes back and forth like this for a while. And finally it dawns on Bonacera that what the Godfather is asking for is friendship, in the ancient Roman understanding of friendship, which is the tribal loyalty to a specific clan. Right? This is the way all of humanity worked for tens of thousands of years and still works in about 85% of the world population, where tribe and family and connections determine all measures of justice. That is the natural way we do things. And finally, Bonacera says, will you be my friend? And drops to a knee. And Godfather arranges to have these guys roughed up. Mario Puzo picked this name for a reason. His first name is Amerigo. And then what Amerigo Bonacera means, good night America. And that's what Bonacera was doing. He was saying goodnight to America. He was turning his back on this entire thing and going back to the sort of tribalism that is natural to us. And I'll just close by saying, don't do it. Go a different way. If it's a tough fight, fine. Be happy warriors, because this is a fantastic fight. It is the best fight. It's really the only fight, because we're on the right side of the single most important thing in all of human history, which is the liberation of humanity, the alleviation of poverty, the ability to pursue happiness as you see it. And what other fight would you want to be part of? And I salute you for being part of it, and thank you all very much.
So in the first one, maybe in the area of national politics, using your recommendation for Aristotle as our guide, do you believe Joe Manchin could be convinced to switch parties?
Yeah, I kind of do. The governor of West Virginia switched, what, 3 months ago, something like that. West Virginia has been moving into a decidedly and permanently red state, certainly in Republican and presidential politics, for a while. Manchin is one of these guys who I think is sincere in his desire to do the bipartisanship, work both sides kind of thing, but he's also this thing called a politician, and I think if it required him to switch parties to stay a senator, I could see him doing it, and he wouldn't be that punished for it. The best way to do that is the way Phil Gramm did it, which is to resign and then run again on the other party label. Phil, it was a congressman when he did it. It's a little tougher as a senator, but it seems to me that would be the best way to do it, because you're not betraying any voters that way. You're giving them a choice.
Okay, there's a few here. We'll get this out of the way in a hurry. There's a bunch of guests here tonight who would like to know about your mom.
My mom's a terrific lady. She's doing fine. She's, I believe, 82 now. About 7 years ago, she ended her brief flirtation with cigarettes after 64 years, and she's doing great. My wife is one of 9 kids, so we got something like 22 grandkids on her side, and we got 1 on my side. And so we named her Lucy, which helps. And she dotes on my daughter, and she's the crazy old lady up on the hill with a lot of cats, and that's what she wants to be. And her website's going great at lucienne.com. And I talk to her a couple times a week, and she's great.
That's great, thank you. Okay. With Gorsuch on the court and knowing what a Hillary court would be like, this is kind of crazy, but would you regret not voting for Trump? Does
Would
that
I
make
regret?
sense? Yeah, that's...
I'm not sure I get it. So for those who don't know, I didn't vote for Trump. I certainly didn't vote for Hillary either. But I also live in Washington, D.C., and my vote didn't matter. And my position always was that if I lived in some swing state where I thought my vote might matter, I would probably vote for Donald Trump. But that's not what was ever interesting to me. For me, the interesting thing is what am I going to write and what am I going to say? And my job is to say what I believe to be true. And part of this thing about tribalism is that I'm not a cheerleader for any team. And so I think Gorsuch is fantastic. I think Donald Trump's appointments to the lower courts are fantastic. I also think his tweeting is idiotic. I can say both things at the same time. I'm not part of the resistance. The resistance is ridiculous. Their position is, Donald Trump put salt on his French fries. Hitler put salt on his French fries. That's not my position. But I've never been a big party guy. I've dedicated my entire professional life to conservatism and conservative principles. And I'm not going to throw them on the back burner because I want to give a Republican president a win, particularly when the win means betraying my principles. And so I just tell the truth as I see it. It pisses off a lot of people, and so be it.
That's great. Yeah. Thanks very much. That kind of question was inevitable, and there were a few of those here, and I feel we've addressed them all. So if you don't hear your specific question, you have the answer of that. Kind of getting back to our roots, if the miracle occurred in the 18th century in Britain, why was the American War of Independence necessary?
Because we were like, as Tommy Lee Jones says in Firebirds, we had our heads and our hearts wired together for some full tilt boogie for freedom and justice. So it is absolutely true in the grand scheme of colonial uprisings, what America had to put up with was pretty minor compared to what the Romans did in Jerusalem or anything like that, or what the Soviets did in Afghanistan. I mean, you can go down a long list. And the short answer to that is, so what? The great thing about the war so when the Declaration of Independence was signed, the most important part was the ending. 100 years later, the most important part is the beginning. And but either way you want to look at it, the American colonists saw themselves as Englishmen who were being denied their rights as Englishmen. And this is how the progress gets made, is where, and sort of like I was talking about earlier about how a lot of these ideas of Western civilization start with Judaism and then Christianity universalizes it. These ideas of liberty start with the Glorious Revolution and stretch back to like the 12th century in England. There's a very Whiggish history of England, but there was a lot of sort of democracy. The idea of a man's home is his castle is a bedrock of English law going back like 8 centuries. So there's these weird, quirky cultural things about England that have to do with the weakness of feudalism and the power of the individual and all of these things that made England quirky. And they brought those ideas to the United States, and they got intensified, and they got purified, and they got sort of like, there's a lot of argument about whether John Locke's second treatise on government, which is sort of the basis of the Glorious Revolution and of the American Revolution for a lot of political philosophers, whether it had any influence on anybody at all, right? Or whether it just reflected where the culture was at the time. The English were reneging on their obligations as Englishmen to the American colonists to the point where we said, screw it, we're not Englishmen anymore, we're Americans. As Bill Murray says in Stripes, we're not Watusis, and we picked up this, and we took these cultural things and we translated them into actual, more refined principles. So in Locke's second treatise on government, he says that you need to have religious tolerance, except for the Catholics, right? And then Jefferson takes the inherent internal logic of Locke's notes on toleration and turns them into the religious statute of Virginia, where he says not only should you have tolerance for Catholics, you should have tolerance for Hindus and pagans and atheists, because the principle is what matters. And so America sort of took these ideas from England, put them in a centrifuge, spun them around, purified them, and wrote them down. And that's why the War of American Independence was necessary. And I know I'm going along on this, but it's an important point. One of my old heroes, the late sociologist Seymour Martin Lipset, who studied American exceptionalism and studied America very closely, former head of the American Political Science Association and the American Sociological Association, and a conservative in a lot of ways. Conservatives love to do this, compare North Korea versus South Korea. It shows you how wonderful capitalism is. Or compare East Germany to West Germany, a great natural experiment. The greatest natural experiment in the last 300 years is Canada versus the United States. If you were all about freedom and justice in 1776, you either stayed in the 13 colonies or you moved there. If you were a loyalist or a royalist who didn't want to break off, you moved up to Canada or you stayed there. Same genetic population, same ethnic population, same language, same culture, identical. What a great natural experiment. Marty Lipset used to point out that in the 1970s, the United States government and the Canadian government at the same time told their people, we're switching to the metric system. Canadians, who come from this culture of saying okay to whenever the government tells them what to do, they're like, when you ask a Canadian how far something is, he says, it's 10 kilometers, right? I mean, that's all that witchcraft. Americans are like, we're not switching to the metric system. Are you crazy? And they just ignored it entirely. And that's the difference in our cultures. And I think it's a wonderful thing.
Okay, very good. Well, this is not a question, it's a comment just to show that some of your fans came out at night. Someone would like to go back to every now and then use the phrase cheese-eating surrender monkeys.
Okay, well.
So there was an acknowledgement for that.
I just won't explain it. I'll just let it sit there.
Yeah.
Seething like the telltale heart.
Yeah.
What was that about?
Yeah, if you're an old Jonah fan, you got it. And if
it's an old Simpsons reference that a lot of people think I invented it. I didn't. I just wildly popularized it. Where the Scottish gardener says he's put in charge of the school because of budget cuts of teaching French. And they just cut to this one quick scene where just, bonjour, you cheese-eating surrender monkeys. And I just thought it was one of the funniest things I'd ever heard. So,
well, people here remember it too. So switching back to politics a little bit, your opinion, who do you view would be the likely future political leaders of the GOP? And what do you think about a role of Ben Shapiro for that?
I talked to Ben today. Future leaders of the GOP. It's a tough one right now. The GOP is in rough shape, which is really ironic given that in terms of the seats it controls, it's doing more, is more entrenched in power than any time since the 1920s, but it is in complete ideological and political disarray in terms of getting things done. And I don't think, look, I'm a skeptic and a critic of a lot of the stuff that Trump has done, but it takes two to tango. And this idea that like Bob Corker is some sort of hero for criticizing Trump only when he's retiring, and who I don't think he begged Trump for his endorsement for the Senate run. I do think, because I know, that he ingratiated himself enormously to try to become either his VP pick or his Secretary of State. And so you have a lot of this sort of problem throughout the GOP where people are doing a lot of finger in the wind stuff, and Trump calls them on it, and it makes it even more awkward. I personally, I'm friends with and like Ben Sasse a lot. I respect Ben Sasse a lot. I think, and I'll just put it out there, because I know people are of mixed minds about the establishment and all that kind of stuff. I don't want Mitch McConnell to be president of the United States, don't get me wrong. But, if people want to cite Neil Gorsuch as a reason to sort of be incredibly happy and content and satisfied and proud of their support for Donald Trump, yes, Donald Trump deserves support for putting Neil Gorsuch on the Supreme Court. Mitch McConnell deserves more because he resisted an enormous amount of pressure
Yeah.
to put Merrick Garland on there for a year before Trump was even elected. It took real courage and real discipline to do it. And he also got that nomination through a 52-seat Senate, which was not easy to do either. And there's a lot of blame to go around, but it is not all establishment bad, outsider good. And it's certainly not Steve Bannon good. It's a complicated situation. So I don't know who the future people are. I hope it's people from the states. I'm sick of senators as a general proposition. I don't know why Sunday shows have them all the time, because I don't care what they say. Ben Shapiro's great. I don't know if he's running for office.
No, not that I know of.
Have a hard time campaigning on the Sabbath, but if he wants to run, that'd be great. Smart guy.
Right. This is kind of a good pointed question. Have you ever been able to convince a liberal to become a conservative?
Well, since my daughter was born a barbarian, I've moved people along. I didn't have the success my dad had in making my mom a conservative. The old joke in the Goldberg circles is I inherited my brains from my dad and my balls from my mom. Yeah, in college, I definitely brought along quite a few people where I at least convinced them, you know, we don't all have horns or hooves or anything like that.
Well, that's a great question. Actually, I'd like to throw it out to the audience. Any of you? Have you ever been able to want there? Well, since she's running for governor, a couple here, so not many. It is very difficult. You know,
I get emails from people saying that they saw the light for me, but you know, I just assume they're trying to sell me something. So.
All right. That's like. Do you consider yourself a classical liberalism, to be classical liberal, or more akin to modern conservatism or libertarianism? And which one do you side with? So that question comes up a lot in this area, the flavors.
It gets complicated, right? I've become more libertarian over the years on a lot of issues, but I don't call myself a libertarian except when I'm feeling saucy on a Saturday night. I do consider myself a classical liberal, but not simply a classical liberal. I consider myself a conservative in the Reagan, William F. Buckley mold. I mean, I can cite you chapter and verse on the conservatives I like and don't like. But I think the important point to be made is that conservatism, rightly understood, is about more than classical liberalism. But conservatism without classical liberalism isn't worth conserving. And this is one of the things that makes American conservatism different from almost any other conservatism in the world. Friedrich Hayek, libertarians, I've debated libertarians about libertarianism versus conservatism 5 billion times. And they always love to quote the Friedrich Hayek essay, Why I'm Not a Conservative. But they never want to read the essay. And in the essay, he explains that he's not a conservative in the European sense of conserving throne and altar, conserving ancient feudal stuff. And he says, in America, that's why in America is the only country in the world where you can call yourself a conservative and still be a champion of liberty, because you were trying to conserve the institutions and principles of a radical revolution for liberty. And so conservatism is about more than conserving the Constitution. It's about more than conserving the free market. But without that stuff, then you drift off into one kind of statism or another.
Okay. Right. Now, there are a lot of really good questions here, but we'll just do a few more because we want you all to get to meet Jonah. We've got books to sell down here in the corner. We'll switch to education. With so many of the problems you described start with education, what conservative solutions do we have to rescue our schools? Quick question, of course.
Yeah, no, it's tough. I think counterintuitively, one of the things that would be really good is if you made education a desirable career for people who didn't want to sort of transform the world. It's amazing, you know, I send my kid to a very good school. My friends send their kids to very good schools in DC, and it's still transgender bathrooms and Native American Peoples Day and all this kind of stuff, because those are the people who want to be teachers. And it's also the people who want to be journalists. And I have a big explanation for this in the book about what I call the new class. I don't call it that. I use the phrase I get from other people. But school choice is only part of the answer. The real answer is figuring out how to actually get people who like the country and are grateful for the country to teach about the country, rather than teach people just to nurture their identity politics grievances and to see themselves as bound up in the iron cage of identity, and that, you know, that whiteness is evil and blackness is good and all these kinds of things. That is directly contrary to the idea of the country, which says that you're supposed to take people as you find them and not see them as representatives of a group. And until we get past that, I don't know what else, you know.
Right.
School choice is good, but it's not going to solve the whole problem.
Right. So sort of staying in that vein, a little more humorous, you wrote a big book on liberal fascism. How do you explain to a millennial with a short attention span that it's actually that fascism is practiced by the left?
Like, I mean, I got to talk about fascism all day long. Right? So the thing is first of all, you got to do is you got to convince people that words aren't things, right? And if I describe fascism objectively, what the fascist platform of 1922 in Italy, what the Nazi platform of 1920, co-written by Adolf Hitler and Anton Drexler, if you describe them, what they actually call for, and say, what does that sound like to you? They'll say, oh, that sounds pretty socialist, right? And then you say, well, surprise, it's fascism. Oh, that's not possible, right? You know, and we get hung up on names for things rather than actually looking at the things of them in themselves. And which is why I'm a firm believer that socialism and nationalism, in a very real sense, are the same thing. You know, take a speech by Hugo Chavez or Fidel Castro, and you replace every word. Every time you see the word socialist, replace it with nationalist, and every time you see nationalist, replace it with socialist. You don't change the meanings of any of the sentences. All right? When you nationalize healthcare, you socialize medicine. And they're all just different forms of group thinking. And every socialist country eventually becomes nationalist, including the Soviet Union. And every nationalist country that doesn't maintain its commitment to liberal democratic capitalism eventually becomes socialist. Because all it is about is concentrating power in the form of the government in the name of we the people, which is always not we the people, but just a subsection of them. And so the only thing that maintains these things, I get tired of getting caught up in the labels, is just is this miracle, this thing that we invented. We are at the summit of history. We reached the top in terms of conceptual thinking about how to organize society. There's no higher ground to get to. And when you're at the top of a mountain, it doesn't matter if you move to the left or to the right, you're still moving down. And that's where we are. And if you want to move left out of liberal democratic capitalism, you're moving down and backwards. If you want to move right out of liberal democratic capitalism, you're moving down and backwards. This is it. And we should teach people to appreciate it and value it.
That's a great answer. That's a good answer. And I think one more. This is a nice ending. Someone said, "Thank you for your contributions to the Hugh Hewitt Show, and please come back." So that's the first one there.
Is Dwayne here? Is
yes.
Here's
a question. Just a little bit of international. How do you see Israel's role in the world, politics changing with the Trump administration?
How do I see Israel's role in the world politics with the Trump administration?
I think so.
I think Trump is pro-Israel. I think people who think he's not are sort of lacking in evidence. And I don't really blame him for saying he's not going to move the embassy to Jerusalem until, you know, we try a peace deal, because that's what all presidents do. I think that the changes for Israel's role in the world have more to do with the problems in the region than they have to do with the United States of America. You know, the Middle East is basically the Middle East is like the Spanish Civil War right now, with huge competing ideological forces going to war with each other. Sunnis versus Shia, Iranians versus Saudis. And it's dawning on a lot of these countries who have been incredibly cynical by it's sort of like the UN Human Rights Council, right? The UN Human Rights Council, I think I said this in special report not too long ago, is the greatest hive of scum and villainy the world has ever known.
Yep.
And there's a reason for it, because all the bad countries, in order to protect themselves from criticism, it's public choice theory 101, they join the Human Rights Council and then they all scream, look at Israel, right? And so in the last, I don't know, 10 years, there are all these different versions of these statistics. There have been like 200 censures or condemnations from the UN of countries, and Israel's gotten like 196 of them. And I think there are a lot of people in the region, partly because of fracking, which is changing the way oil works, partly because of other things going on in the region. They're realizing that sort of feeding their own populations hatred of Israel is no longer really working as a way to keep their populations in line. And so Saudi Arabia just allowed women to drive cars. You know, they have to phase it in because a move that radical can't be done overnight. And this new guy, you know, who's going to be running Saudi Arabia, the new king, he kind of seems like he's a modernizer, and they get it. And you can't be a modernizer when all you're doing is telling people that all of their problems have to do with these 5.5, 6 million Jews over here who have tripled their per capita GDP while we've languished in crap, and they've done it with democracy, and they protect civil rights more than our country does. And so I'm hoping at some point we'll get a breakthrough, but the region's a hot mess, and things could definitely go the wrong way. On that cheery note,
Yes,
buy bonds.
Do that. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Jonah Goldberg. Okay.